Great. And we're live. So welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And I'm super excited because today on the line, I have Jack Berglund. You're the Chief Product Officer at Doodle, which is very exciting. I've used Doodle for years and I'm a huge fan. And you're located right now in Zurich, Switzerland, which is actually where I met you for the first time in person at a meetup there. So when I saw your talk about remote working and I saw that you were working at Doodle, I just had to have you on the podcast. So thank you for agreeing to be here.
Oh, great. Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Well, we'll start with question number one. It's always the same, which is, what does your virtual office look like? What do you need to get your work done?
So here at Doodle, we're split across 4 offices, sort of dotted around Europe, headquartered here in Switzerland. And I think one of the interesting challenges we have at the moment is we have more and more projects as the company grows that are kind of split across 2, 3, or even 4 of those offices. So although we don't see ourselves as a remote working company, we definitely have many of the challenges of having a lot of meetings, a lot of conversations that are spread across lots of different locations. For me personally, I think, all I really need to get my work done is a laptop, my phone, and some headphones. Here I'm using the sort of Apple AirPods. I actually find they're very good. Just from the perspective, super small, to always have them in my pocket. One problem I do have with them, and I have this with a lot of headphones, is if you are in a noisy place, they tend to pick up the background noise louder than the voices. So that's a bit of a challenge. If anyone does know, I'm looking for the sort of the holy grail of headphones where not only are they noise cancelling, but also with a microphone that cancels the background noise as well.
Amen. For anybody listening, please write in. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, of course. So yeah, that would be ideal, but I'm pretty basic. I can work from sort of anywhere. I think, the main thing is just to have a semi-silent space to work in, but I'm really not fussy whether it's a beach, a coffee shop, the couch, whatever it is. One of the challenges I see actually working in an office every day, we have a lot of engineers in the office who like a very kind of quiet and focused environment. So in order to take phone calls to do things like this, I actually have to find a space somewhere outside of the office, not to annoy everyone. So we're definitely thinking about getting some little telephone booths, soundproof booths to have in the office as well.
That is a major issue that people in offices talk about, which is the noise. When I went to IKEA, they had quiet areas where it was really, and then decibel meters so that you could measure the level of noise that was in those areas. But in a lot of places, they do. There is a problem with finding a conference room or finding a quiet space to go to. So you're not alone there. But before we get into some of that, I want to talk about, before you worked at Doodle, you had 4 years of remote working experience where you said you were the only person in Europe working with a team that was elsewhere. And I'm curious about your workspaces that you used then. What kind of places did you have or did you go to?
Yeah, definitely. The sort of headquarters were New York. So there was a certain amount of traveling back and forth, but most of my time I was actually in my home office. And I think the first year it felt really nice. It's convenient. You don't lose any time commuting, but the longer and longer you spend in sort of relatively small space, and your sort of ability to take a break and get out of there becomes more important. So I discovered, thankfully, after about a year, there was a really nice coffee shop at the bottom of the hill with very good coffee. So that was a good escape. One thing I did try that worked quite well is I had a friend who's also in a similar situation, working from home a lot, and we would actually swap offices. So I would go and work from his home and he would work from mine, just to kind of get that separation of home and space, even though you're actually in someone else's home. And yeah, that worked kind of nicely from just a mental separation. And the other upside was we would try and sort of cross over. So, if he came to my house, we would sit and have coffee, a bit of a chat, and then, I would leave for his home. So kind of a slightly unorthodox solution, but it worked pretty well.
I think it's a great solution. It kills two birds with one stone, though I don't like that expression because who wants to kill birds, right? But one is the loneliness, and the other is the mental separation, which indeed is quite an issue for people who are working from their home offices. When you made the switch from going to working from home offices or coffee shops to working from an office every day, did you have any trouble transitioning, or were you like, oh no, I missed this, I'm ready for it? What was your experience with that?
Yeah, I was surprised. I hadn't anticipated it. It was actually quite hard to be in an environment where you're constantly surrounded by people. When I was working at home, I spoke to a lot of people, Skype and so on throughout the day. But really, if I wanted an hour of kind of alone time, so to say, it was very easy, right? I just don't pick up the phone or, don't call people. So yeah, it was kind of interesting. I assume some of my colleagues may listen to this, so they may have a chuckle, but I definitely, when I first arrived in the office, found it a little bit of an adjustment to sort of, have a little bit of small talk with everyone and kind of be surrounded by people all day long. The solution was really just time. It happens quite quickly. Within a few weeks, you get very, very used to it again. But I guess it made me realize that I had been a little bit isolated when I was working at home.
And was it ever an issue for you working at home, the isolation, or was it, I mean, for me, when I worked in my home office alone, I loved it. I did not have the I feel too lonely or I feel isolated issue at all. But a lot of remote workers do talk about that.
I think the way I work and my personality is reasonably well suited to it. So I didn't have a huge problem. I think, I like a decent amount of time in the day by myself. I'm totally fine with that. But it was more, I think, over a sustained period of 3 or 4 years where you notice that you're less used to just kind of chatting with people where it's not directly kind of on a topic or, you phoned them for a reason.
Yeah, I lost some social skills myself in that process.
That's basically it. Yes,
parties were a lot more difficult somehow. Yeah,
that's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to go back to Doodle and talk about how you guys are working there. You say you have 4 offices spread out. Are they in very different time zones, or are they in relatively the same time zones? Where are the offices?
Yeah, it's not too bad. We're in Zurich, Berlin, in the same time zone. We have Belgrade and then Tel Aviv. So we're all within 2 hours of each other, which is a very good thing. And earlier in my career, I worked on a long project where we had a large team in Bangkok, and I was working in New York with a team there, and we were about 50-50 split. The trouble with those 2 locations is they happen to be 12 hours apart, which with hindsight was not so smart. And I think in some ways that's more important than the physical distance. So you could be a long way apart, but in a similar time zone, and it would be less problematic. Yeah, I mean, 12 hours, we didn't really think about it until it was too late, but it's actually worse than, New York, Australia is 16 hours.
Yeah.
Which sounds worse, but actually it means you're only 8 hours away going around the clock the other way. 12, you've got no good way of setting it up, really.
What did you guys do for your time zone issues? What were some of the tricks or some of the things that you did?
Yeah, it was quite brutal, I think, for both sides. We were quite determined on the New York end not to force, a one-way kind of street where we dictated the times and let our kind of colleagues in Thailand just work late every day. So we tried to be fair and sort of make sure, if one team worked late one evening, we would sort of reciprocate the next time. So it wasn't just one way. But I think, it's tricky would be the answer.
Yeah.
And then one general observation, and, from that time forwards, I've always kind of maintained this, where it's really, really important just to meet people once somewhere at the beginning, so that you kind of, every other conversation from that point forward is that much easier.
Yeah, there is just, I've really been an advocate for virtual teams and remote working, of course, like over the top, but there is nothing like meeting somebody in person. It's just different. And as humans, I think we're programmed to respond to each other in person. So I really like that advice. I've also taken to it. So
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. I think I can remember it was while working on this very split project, we had a meeting to discuss, why things weren't working and how the last year hadn't gone so well. And we realized it was the first time we'd all been in the same place. And that was perhaps the main reason, as it turned out.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about, I want to first talk about what Doodle does for anybody who's been living in a cave for the last 3 years and has never heard of Doodle. What is Doodle, and what do you guys do?
So yeah, Doodle is a scheduling tool. I think sometimes people don't recognize the name, but then you talk to them and they realize they've used it. Essentially, you put in the times when you think you might be able to meet. You send it around, and you can have your colleagues or your friends put in the times that they can make. And it's actually a really quick and easy way to find a mutual time when everyone's available. We have users all across the spectrum. At one end, people organizing board meetings and team offsites and these kind of things in the work setting, all the way through to kind of bachelor party and weekend away on the personal side. Our focus right now is really on the sort of the business end of things, so to say, because one thing we hear and one thing we know from working with our customers is that although we have all these digital tools to help with calendaring, quite often scheduling a meeting is this kind of endless back and forth where it's email, chat. Sometimes you end up just having to pick up the phone, maybe have to phone multiple people to kind of resolve these conflicts. And Doodle's a really nice solution to getting to that kind of time much, much quicker. The other thing we see, which makes some ways of scheduling difficult and where Doodle's actually very effective, is when I don't know, for those listening who work perhaps in sort of medium and large companies, what we see a lot is people's calendars no longer kind of truly reflect their availability. So I'm going to put a blocker in that morning because I know I have to prepare for this, or I've had so many meetings, I want to block out my Friday afternoon. And the only way then to kind of negotiate a time is each person has to comment and say, yes, I'm actually available, even though my calendar says I'm not. So we're building on what we already have, but really trying to solve some of these slightly more gnarly problems where you have a large group of people trying to meet, or it's people across different companies. So, perhaps it's you and some colleagues trying to meet with a client and actually figuring out kind of an optimal time without it spending, taking an inordinate amount of time. We did do a survey recently with some business folks in the US and discovered that for the sort of power scheduler, if you like, for the average sort of manager or team lead, that they spend more than a day a week scheduling when you add up the hours. So yeah, I think there's some work to do, and hopefully moving towards obviously minimizing the time and making it much, much easier.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And yeah, indeed, scheduling, if you've got more than 2 or 3 people that you're scheduling for a meeting, it is rough to try, or more than 2 or 3 time zones. It is rough trying to find a mutual time. Yeah, I use Doodle all the time on my virtual team with Happy Melly and Management 3.0. We use it all the time because we've got like 15 people spanning from Canada to India, and it's just impossible to get everybody to meet at the same time. So yeah, Doodle has been helpful there. Now, you said you've got people in 4 different offices. I want to talk about that. That is a very common scenario for companies out there where you have offices in different places. So you're not necessarily working remotely, but you are working with colleagues in different offices. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about some of the challenges that you guys face in terms of working with, different groups. So yeah, I'll stop there and then dive into part 2.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's 2 challenges that leap out most immediately. One is just the process of running a meeting. And I know that's something that you deal with and talk about a lot. The 5 minutes we seem to lose setting up the video conferencing. We use Google Hangouts here. It's getting better all the time, and we're getting better at using it, but there's still some challenges there. And then throughout the course of the meeting, I think it's some facet of human nature. I'm sure there have been studies done, but when you're on the phone, it's that much harder to stay engaged. I always feel guilty when I'm the remote person and I find my mind wandering, but people have assured me that that's not uncommon, and it's when you're not physically there, it kind of inevitably happens. One tip I actually picked up from you, Lisette, that we started using is just to start the meeting and say, hey, look, if someone on the remote end starts speaking, let's give them priority. Let's just stop speaking in the room. Very, very simple. It was something I heard you talking about when you were in Zurich, and just that little thing, I think it's both an effective trick, if you like, but also it sort of seeds in people's minds, just saying it at the start of the meeting that, oh yes, we do have to be aware that these guys are there on the phone. So that was actually very effective. So there's the meetings themselves, which is one challenge, and I think technology helps and some sort of etiquette there as well. The flip side is I don't know if there's a term for this, but just sometimes a couple of you are in one location, you have a conversation, and you don't realize, but you've made a decision. So you talked about something and it could have been X or Y, and you've sort of made a decision. And sometimes it's not super obvious. It's not like you got together to decide X. It's just you were talking about something, and now there's a path that's clear. And because you didn't feel like there was a decision being made strongly, the tendency is to sort of not communicate that, or communicate it very late, or not do it in a sort of formal way. So I think it requires some discipline and a little bit of self-awareness to say, okay, while we were standing by the whiteboard, we did actually make a decision, and it's maybe small and maybe doesn't directly impact everyone else, but we need to tell them, because they'll make another decision that might depend on this, and so on and so forth. So those are the two kind of main things of it.
And what tools do you use to communicate with each other across offices?
We use Slack a lot. So we have email, but we don't use it, I would say. I probably receive 2 emails a day. Most of them are automated. But we've swapped it, instead of an avalanche of emails, we have an avalanche of Slacks instead. I did have a quick look. Slack sends you the statistics on the usage, and Doodle's a very transparent company. So we generally like our communications to be, in a place where everyone can see what's going on. So the vast majority of our Slack channels, the sort of group communication, is actually done kind of out in the open. So our stat was 92% of the messages sent in channels are done in public channels.
Wow.
And that kind of relates back to wanting to be quite kind of transparent and open, just in terms of what's going on. In terms of other tools, we use Google Hangouts for kind of the remote meetings. We have our own setup. So Doodle exists. We have our office, but it exists inside a larger building that belongs to our parent company, which is TAM Media, a Swiss company. And when it's our own setup, we have our own little Chromebox devices. They're not expensive and very easy to kind of set up and get going. And it works pretty well. It does require someone who kind of knows how it works, just to set it up a minute or two ahead of time. We've been through a really interesting problem with our parent company, because they have their own Google have a kind of more managed version of Hangouts. I think they're renaming it to Meet. And of course, if you're not part of their system, it can be a little bit troublesome. So we're getting there. We now have, actually, I don't know if people know the company Robin, but they have the little tablets on the meeting rooms, and you check in, and it's slowly getting better. But we've definitely had a period where every time we start a meeting, there's where's the link? Oh, I'm on the wrong link. So getting better at that. That's really the main tool sets. Yeah.
And for tracking tasks, what do you use for that?
We're mostly a Jira shop. I think
Jira
is a very popular tool, particularly around software development. It definitely has its fans, but it definitely has its people who are slightly allergic to using it. My own view as well, it's not always the most optimal tool for every single task or task tracking that you want to do. What I personally really love about it is you can set off using Jira knowing that you'll never hit a scenario where it can't do what you want. You might have to jump through some hoops to get it to do it, but it can ultimately do it. So you'll never be limited by the tool. There are a lot of other great tools around. We do use Trello for sort of lightweight task tracking. We're trying out Asana, which is another kind of project management tool. But the risk is always, well, they're maybe stronger in some areas. You get to a point you say, oh, now we want to do this or integrate with that, and it's not possible. So I'm kind of a big fan of Jira for that reason. As I say, it's a bit of a polarizing tool. Some people love it, some people hate it. But yeah.
It can do everything.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about management and virtual team management. I don't know if you're the chief product officer, so that probably means you do a lot of everything. But in terms of managing projects and tasks and people across these 4 offices, because you mentioned that it started that the projects were sort of in each individual office, but now it's growing so that they're dividing a bit between offices. What are some of the tips or advice or things that you've noticed about managing people across different offices like this? I know it's a broad question, so whatever first comes to mind.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think being mindful of it. So just to give you a very quick example, we sort of spent a bit of time drawing out our user journey for one of our products. It's a very productive exercise. How do people learn about the products? How do they get activated and start using it? How do you retain them and so on? Kind of a big flowchart on a whiteboard. This is a complete tangent, but we have these little cards. They're sort of reusable post-its by a company called Memox. They're actually very, very cool. They're sort of magnetic cards you can write on with a whiteboard marker. But that is a tangent. We then, very quickly realized, well, of course, one of the team members is not in the office. Having this whiteboard was not especially useful. So another tool I would actually recommend, back to the tools thing, is real-time board, which is kind of you can collaborate in real time, put sticky notes on a board, link them up with a flow chart, and so on. In terms of management of people, I think perhaps the best way to sum it up is there's a tendency to kind of lose common sense when people are remote. So you might have a team all in one place, and you'd be, naturally inclined to meet with everyone on a regular basis, get together as a team, do some social events, and it all happens quite naturally. And so when you have people remote, that same sort of common sense should apply, but I think there's a tendency, the meetings are more difficult because we're remote, so maybe we'll have less meetings. Obviously getting together is more difficult in person, so we have to kind of manage that side of things as well. I do travel around quite a bit, which is a sort of nice to be able to do and actually meet people in person. One rule Doodle has, it's actually a really nice piece of basically every employee every year can go and work for a week in any of the locations where we have an office. They don't need a business reason. They just go and sort of hang out in the other office, and that's a way of trying to bring people in the offices closer together.
That's a great rule. I mean, who wouldn't want to go to Tel Aviv or Belgrade or Berlin or Zurich for that matter? I mean, I'm a Switzerland lover, so any excuse to go to Zurich, I'd be like, heck yeah.
Yeah.
But that is a great idea. And it's good to also just switch up your workspace every once in a while and just see. But meeting your colleagues in their work environment, it doesn't get more valuable than that. Great policy.
Yeah, it's nice. The other thing that springs to mind is we had an effort. We were sort of trying to say, okay, we want our offices to be close together, and obviously that was part of it. Where things started to naturally, I would say, become more integrated was when we started having projects that spanned multiple offices. So on the one hand, it's a challenge, but it's actually a nice way of knitting the offices together. If you have a work reason to talk to a colleague in another office every single day, you kind of naturally shorten the distance as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you have to talk to somebody, you get to know them, whether you want to or not. Are there any cultural differences that you find between, Berlin and Zurich or Belgrade or Tel Aviv that you've had to deal with?
There are, and we sort of do try and be mindful of them. My own personal experience, having worked kind of, in Asia, in the US, and in Europe, is actually you can overstate the cultural differences. It's hard, it's because different culture or whatever. I think people are kind of fundamentally the same on some level. And if you treat people a certain way, they will respond a certain way. It's reasonably consistent. I think some of the challenges are, varies by culture and by language, how sort of proactive people are in terms of sort of giving information, and how direct people are in terms of explaining what they mean. I'm personally not the most direct. I'm British. I'm sort of I like to talk around and get to the point eventually, which I think for some of my German colleagues is a little bit strange. They would like me to just say what the point is. That's the point of the conversation. So I definitely do see some differences there.
But I like that. Don't overstate the differences, because indeed, people are generally people everywhere. They're fundamental. I believe that they're fundamentally the same, and it's just our behaviors that are slightly different. And when we get curious and ask more why, then we can go a long way in terms of resolving cultural differences, I think. Exactly. Yeah, being curious instead of judgmental. A very easier said than done. Easier said than done. So we're reaching the end of our time, but I have so many more questions. I guess what I would ask is, what we'll end with is any advice for people who are working in these 4 different offices or in multiple offices. I think this is such a common scenario. Sort of your personal advice, if you're working with many different colleagues, what would you recommend to make that a smooth experience for people so that it doesn't become us versus them? Because that seems to be what happens.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very long answer to that. I think if I were to hone in on one thing, I would say, just feel free to reach out to someone who might not be in the same office for absolutely no reason at all, because I think that's where the relationships get built. So it definitely helps that you have a reason to talk to each other, and that's kind of helpful. But then it becomes kind of a very transactional work conversation. If you just sort of message someone that you might have to work with in the future, and just sort of have a chat as you would if they were just sitting next to you, that can help a lot. And that small thing, I think, changes the nature of all those relationships.
That is a great piece of advice. Reach out for no reason at all. I used to have a boss who would call me. He was in California and I was in the Netherlands, and he would call me on the way to work just to say hi and to see how I was doing. And at first it was really like, hey boss, what do you want? Like, get to the point. Get to the point. But there was no point. He was just checking in. And I must say, it made a huge difference in terms of our relationship. I felt like we were more friends than we were a boss employee. It sort of became a like, hey, this guy has my back. He actually cares about how my day was and how I'm doing. And it definitely did make a difference. So yeah, great advice. Great advice. Cool. So very last question is, if people want to learn more about you or Doodle, what's the best place to go? You personally, and then also Doodle.
Yeah, for me personally, probably the best place is LinkedIn. If you just search for my name, Jack Berglund, and Doodle, I should come up. I'm also on Twitter at It's On The Roadmap. It's me on Twitter. And then for Doodle, it's very simple. Just go to doodle.com. You can check out the tools that we have there. Indeed.
So at It's On The Roadmap.
Exactly. Yes.
That is a great Twitter handle for a chief product officer, I must say. Well
it's always
done.
The answer. Is it ready? It's on the roadmap.
Brilliant. Jack, thank you so much for your time today. It's really been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right, everybody. All right, everybody. Until next time, be powerful.